Hi guys, my name is Shiva Bhaggan. I'm a software engineer with 5 years of experience. I'm excited to talk about Node.js and Express framework with scalability in mind. If you are someone who's trying to build a project and bring it into production, then stay tuned.
Hello world, welcome to Collider TV, where we chat with the tech innovators driving the next generation of digital business solutions.
And today we are talking about building a backend for scalability with Node.js and Express framework with senior engineer Shiva Bhaggan. This is part one of a two-part interview where we're going to be diving into what it takes to build and launch your own application. So before we talk to Shiva, let's tell the people a bit about us, right?
Okay, well, my name is Ryan.
And I'm Jacob.
And together, we run Collider, a community of digital business leaders who connect and explore innovative solutions. And we'd love for you to join the conversation. So please like and subscribe on our YouTube channel and learn more about how to get involved at collider.altimetric.com.
Absolutely. And Collider is powered by Altimetric, a leading digital business enablement company, which means that we're creating solutions that drive transformation and achieve business goals for clients all over the world. So if your company is looking to get unstuck and take your digital strategy to the next level, be sure to chat with us. Or if you are a tech professional who's looking for a new career opportunity, we're growing fast and we would love to chat with you about what types of opportunities we have available. But enough about that. Let's go ahead and dive into today's conversation.
Shiva Bhaggan is an accomplished software engineer with extensive experience in web development. He's our Altimetric teammate who works on the AV side of Ford Motor Company as a product and platform engineer. He is also an active contributor to the Collider community. So be sure to check out his chat, Quickly Test and Scale Enterprise Apps with Event-Driven Architecture on our YouTube channel, and we will link below. So, Shiva, tell us a bit about yourself. What inspired your career in software development?
Yeah, so when I was back home and I was attending my bachelor at the university, I was doing like electrical engineering. And we had some courses related to computer science. We were like coding in C++, C Sharp, and a little bit of Java. And that's where I actually realized that, I got some passion for coding itself. And that's where I started thinking about doing software development.
That's great. And how did you specifically zero in on the product and platform development side of the equation?
Well, it all started with my professional career. When I started my project at Ford Motor Company as well, we started with a lot of cool projects, a lot of great techs, and the most important thing is that we learned a lot of implementing a lot of new things. So we did not only start implementing monolith application, but we also started our whole project with microservices. So that was one of the major advantages for my career development.
That's really cool. And so I know a lot of what you focus on is scaling applications. That's a lot of what we've discussed with you, and that's a key piece of today's conversation. So I was hoping just to lay a bit of context before we dive into the nitty-gritty. When you say scalability, what exactly does that mean in this context?
Yeah, so when it comes to scalability, we also want to talk about cost effectiveness. So those most of the time goes hand in hand. When we talk about scalability, we can think about it of scaling just a piece of code, just a piece of software, but we could also think about it as scaling, a whole software architect. So when we talk about scaling a software architect or a piece of code, what we're actually trying to solve is this software going to be able to handle, an unexpected event, for instance, an unexpected traffic to our software. So that's what we are trying to solve, and we are always maintaining that as well.
Got it. Very cool. So coming up with these solutions, it's important to take things from the beginning to the end, right? So now you just talked to us about scalability, but can you talk to us about end-to-end practitioning and what being an end-to-end practitioner means to you?
Sure. Well, if you're working as a software developer, it's not only writing code, obviously, right? You also have to be involved in discussions, when it comes to implementing new technologies into your stack, or discussing about patterns you are trying to avoid or patterns you want actually in your code, right? Because it all depends on the use case. So I feel it's really important to be part of of the whole life cycle of the software development that we already have. It starts from starting with pipelines, making sure your CI/CD is correct in place, making sure you have the best database selection for the use case you're trying to build, and then we discuss about the backend and the front end development as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about it.
Quick question. What is CIC?
CI/CD. So that means continuous development, continuous integration. You want to make
Oh,
sure that, like, if you are building an application, you want to have multiple environments. So you want to make sure you have a test environment, you have a QA environment, and you have a production environment where your actual users are, hitting your APIs or your actual server. So having a CI/CD pipeline in place is really, really important, because if you don't have that, you will not be able to test your application before going into production.
Sounds like some really important considerations. I One more question just about that kind of end-to-end view. Are there business considerations made in your line of work as well? I mean, are you considering, for example, the cost difference between the different tools, or aligning production schedules with some sort of car launch or something like that?
Sure, sure. Cost effectiveness is something we always have to consider, because I'm just going to give you an example. Like when it comes to scalability, right? If you have a piece of code, or let's say just the software itself, and your target is, let's say, 500 users per month, and let's say something happens or your product goes viral, right? And at some point in time you're like getting traffic which maybe 5,000 or maybe even 10,000 users per month. So what you got to do is you got to scale up, and scaling up means you need more resources, and more resources means you will be paying more than you used to pay before. So you want to make sure that you have that scaling up and scaling down in place for you to serve the customers as well. But by the same time, you don't want to have a lot of instances open all the time and then pay for it, but then there's no use for it, right? So that
Yeah,
is something really important, right?
that makes sense. And so, today we're focusing mainly on that scalability piece, but I'm curious, just kind of what are some other considerations that a company or individual might make when they kind of first set out to create a software application?
Sure. Well, I can talk about a personal project I did, and we can maybe compare it with the one I'm doing right now at for motor company as well. So I recently, deployed a project in production, right? And I think it's really important to have the whole pipelines, as I mentioned, in place, because you don't want to go, in production and then realize that you have to make some changes, but you cannot make the changes and deploy it right away in production. You got to make sure you test it before you make it available for the end users. So I think it's really important to discuss, in your software development life cycle about how you're going to tackle those kind of scenarios. And not only that, but you want to make sure that whatever you're trying to implement or develop, you want to make sure that you're using the best tool for your use case, because there are a lot of tools on the market, and your use case again might be different than others. So we probably have to have a good discussion for us to decide which technology stack we are going to work with.
got it. So there are other decisions that you'd have to make too, right? And this may seem, I don't know, like an obvious question. So you tell me if you agree or not. But when you're starting to build, does it always make sense to start with the back end? Or like, why should you start building in the back end? Let me know if that makes sense.
Sure, sure. Well, it depends. See, there are different teams, they have different cultures, right? Let's say if we start, a startup right now, okay? And let's say we have like five developers in our team. But let's say you're five developers, you have maybe two backend developers and three front-end developers. That's just a random number. But so in that case, you do have the resources, right? You have backend developers as well as front-end developers. So in that case, a really nice or an ideal situation would be you could develop the application or the software that you're trying to, develop. You could do that simultaneously. You can start with the backend with your backend team, and you can also start with your front-end team right away. But there is a really good discussion needed between those teams, because they should be the front end team should know how the data will be structured, so they can work independently without waiting or blocked by our backend team. So it depends on the resources you have. That's one. And it also depends on the architect you're following. For instance, the project that I just launched into production, there I used a design first approach. So what I did there is I first made sure that the designs for the screens are ready. And then with the help of those designs, I was trying to see, okay, so this design is, talking about storing the addresses of a particular, user. So we should probably have an API that stores addresses. So you see, you can also connect it with the design as a point to point kind of.
That makes total sense. And I know in this particular conversation, when discussing kind of how to structure this two-part series, we had talked about starting with the back end. So I'm excited to get into that in a moment of kind of why in this particular project you do recommend that path. But just one more kind of question about the getting started piece. So in choosing, when you get started and you're choosing your tech stack, you're choosing the different tools that go into ultimately, making up the what you're going to put into production. Why might you choose Node.js plus Express framework versus other similar technologies that might, do similar things like Java and Spring or something else?
Yeah, good. So, well, it depends. Again, it depends on the project you're going to work on. So let's say if you're working on a project that maybe needs a lot of data calculation, a lot of processor intensive work, maybe a lot of blocking operations, I maybe should say it like that, then maybe Node.js is not the way to go, because you want to consider the best tool, as I mentioned, for your use case. You want to make sure that it's a best fit, it's compatible with your use case. Now, when it comes to the question, why Node.js versus Java, right? I don't think that it's something that we should compare just based on the technology, but we should compare it based on what we are trying to achieve. So maybe we can first start with the pros of Node.js, right? So there is one really cool feature of Node.js that talks about Node.js embracing asynchronous, non-blocking, and single-threaded architecture. Now, what does that mean? So in Node.js, basically what happens is that there is only one single thread. And then most of the time people think if there's only one single thread, then if someone requests a resource from your server, then if that single thread is working on that resource to get it for you, then it's blocked. No other users can use it. But then there's where we should look into, asynchronous non-blocking. Node.js has this kind of feature that if someone requests something, or maybe if a client requests something from the server, what Node.js will do, it will make that request to, for instance, it's calling a database or it's calling a third-party API. It will call that resource, but then it will be available for picking up a next request. It will not wait, it will not block on waiting for that response to return. It is event driven. So that is something we should always consider when we are trying to think about what stack we should use, whether or not Node.js is something that fits. But on the other side, if you're going to work with a project that has a lot of data calculation, like CPU intensive work, right? Now, in that case, Node.js is for sure not a perfect fit, because that single thread will be blocked unless and until the resource is available for a next request, right? So that is something we should always consider. So it's always depending on the use case, on whatever you're trying to design.
Got you. And again, if you're looking for more details about event-driven architecture and how different approaches to event-driven architecture can actually, support scalability with driving app development, definitely check out our talk about quickly scaling and launching apps with event-driven architecture, which we'll link somewhere here. So Shiva, let's get into the nitty gritty here of your recent project that you used Node.js for, and kind of what some of the considerations were specific to that project. So, what were the first steps for you in kind of applying this end-to-end perspective that you bring to the table? What was the consideration in this case, for you as you looked to design and build out the tech stack?
Sure. So every project, right, whether it's a personal project, whether it's an academic project, whether it's a professional project, you always want to follow the software development lifecycle. And, there are some major points that the software development lifecycle talks about. For instance, the planning and requirement analysis. Now, that is something that's of vital importance because you want to make sure what you're trying to build, right? You cannot just straight go into implementation and then discuss, okay, what I'm trying to, implement, which is something I did. So I know how important, SDLC is, the software development lifecycle. After, planning and doing the requirement analysis, it's really important to define those requirements as well. After defining those requirements, what you want to do is you want to design the product architecture. Now, in this phase, you will be talking about, with your team about the tech stack, about the patterns that you are trying to avoid, or the tech stack you want in this, project to be, because we are doing like, real-time data access. So probably IO input, we probably want a Node.js, something for that. So that's in the third phase. In the fourth phase, that's where we're going to talk about building and developing the actual product. Because you can only build and develop your product if you have all your data. I mean, with respect to what you're trying to build and what you need in order to build that product. So that's the only point that where you can say, okay, I'm ready. I can just go straight into the implementation. Now, the next most important step is testing the product. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure you have different environments set up for your application. So you can have the testing as well. You can probably have like a group of users that you want to make sure that they test your product. You can make them part of that environment. You can ask them, so something like a beta version, right? And you ask them to test it out. And, feedback is something that's really important because as a software engineer, most of the times, you probably forget some edge cases. So that's why it's really important to, test driven your approach, right? Always write your tests first. So that's another thing you might want to consider. And again, the last phase of the software development lifecycle, maybe it's a little bit outside the lifecycle, but something we all want is deployment in the market and maintaining it.
Very cool. So does the lifecycle speak to what skills a person needs to learn in order to implement solutions like these? Or how did you learn?
Well, so it depends. Again, if you are building a project or a product, right? As I mentioned, you will be having those analysis design part, right? Where you're going to discover, make some POCs and see whether it's feasible or not. But then at the same time,
POC is proof of concept?
Yes, that's correct.
Got it.
Right.
Sorry,
and you want to, and you want to make sure that you have the resources there. And when I say resources, I'm talking about the engineers. Because if you only have Java developers and you are trying to bring in a Node.js framework, Node.js with Express framework into the product, then you probably will stop, right? Because the engineers need some learning, And again, a nice advantage of Node.js is that it's really, really, really simple. It's one of the most simple, tool out there to build, and it's fast. Not only the development speed, but as well as when you start up an application, you use Visual Code. You can just start up like maybe in not even 10 seconds, and you have like a running up server. So that's really fast.
And in terms of foundational knowledge, you say it's really easy to learn. Is that if you have JavaScript knowledge, or kind of what is the foundational knowledge that would make that easy to learn? If you are a Java engineer with no experience in Node.js, I mean, how easy is it to pick up?
Yeah. So I would say if you have the JavaScript, background, the technical background about JavaScript, it would help you a lot. But even if you don't have it, if you just have Java background, the concept is the same because it's just by the end of the day, it's just the technology, right? The concept will always remain the same.
Hmm.
So that is something that will always be, there, right?
Gotcha. So as you are going through this process and you've put the amount of kind of holistic thought into it that you're describing, and you've chosen your stack and all these things. So what are some common challenges that you might run into? And kind of playing off of that, what resources do you recommend for somebody to potentially get unstuck? Where can folks turn to for some support?
Cool. So when it comes to Node.js and Express, I would say there is like world-class documentation out there of Express itself. So on Express framework website itself, you could get like a lot of great documentation on how to start up your own server. When it comes to JavaScript on its own, documentation is there as well. Really good documentation, really easy to follow along. Even if that's something that you're still not, satisfied with, then there are a lot of, video tutorials on YouTube. You have like a lot of articles. If you have like Medium, you can also follow on Medium. A lot of great articles about how to, implement certain things with best practices in mind. So yeah, for sure.
Got it.
Got it. And Shiva, so you have experience in both independent app developing and working for large corporations. Would you say that there are considerations that are similar in both cases?
Well, the situation probably is a little bit different because, see, if you're working for a huge corporation, you want to make sure that every commit, every push you make, like every change into your code, you have to make sure you can, talk about it because it's something that's going to be used by millions of users, right? You cannot just try it out and see what happens. Rather than when you work on your own project, you can just test it out. If it fails, the loss is probably not even, I mean, it's reasonable. So that is one of the major differences that you got to be really careful when you're making changes into the code base, when you're working for these huge companies. And I think it's also really important that, I mean, regardless whether it's a personal project or, project for professional, company, you want to make sure you always follow the best practices, and you always want to make sure you write maintainable and readable code, because by the end of the day, other engineers will join. You want to make sure they understand what what you've accomplished.
And when and how does security fit into that mix? So there's a lot of talk about secure code these days, and what it takes to write secure code, OWASP top 10 and all these different things. Could you tell us just a little bit about those types of considerations as you work through these tools?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to security, nowadays they have like a lot of frameworks that takes care of that. When new frameworks comes in, the problem they are trying to solve for engineers itself is that they want to make sure you don't spend much time on the infrastructure, on how secure it is. They want to make sure that you spend time on the business logic so that you can deliver. So those frameworks are there to help you. You can just use it. For instance, in Java, in a Java ecosystem, you can probably use Spring Security that handles your security, which is really good. And when it comes to Node.js and Express, when you're building APIs, we have like a lot of strategies on how to secure your APIs, how to secure your code. And not only that, but also when you deploy your code, you want to make sure you don't commit secret keys into the code base so that other people can read it. You want to make sure you encrypt those files. So you got to make sure you do those things. But on a higher level, there are frameworks that takes care of the more high level security.
Got you. And so, I know we're only talking about kind of half the equation. We're only focusing on the back end at the moment, but are there other valuable tools in your stack? You've mentioned a number of different, really awesome suggestions. Are there other valuable tools in your stack that you think are worth mentioning? And then kind of asking a bit more broadly, like, how do you even come across these different tools? Is this something you're reading about on forum, on Stack Overflow, or like where are you finding these different tools to begin with?
Sure. Well, there is a for JavaScript, there is like a huge community out there, right? So articles are there. People are writing like every day about what they are trying to achieve, how they accomplish certain kind of things. So you will get a lot of resources on the internet. And when it comes to tools and resources, I would probably say, when it comes to tools, if you're building your own project, for instance, and you're trying to bring it into production, and for instance, I'm just going to give an example. If you want to maintain, a way that users can, integrate with your application or use your application in a way that they can process payments, for instance, right? So there are a lot of payment gateways out there that you want to try out, just see how it works. And again, for instance, Stripe. I've been using Stripe, and Stripe is one of the best tool I've used so far with respect to accepting payments and making payment integrations with your API or with your app.
Yeah.
And they have world class documentations as well. So I would suggest, if you're building your own project and you want payments, try to look into those kind of tools as well, because they are really necessary.
And I suspect that probably saves quite a bit of time. Obviously, you're not about to build out a payment processor from scratch, or
Yes. Right.
So I think, like, in general, what I've kind of picked up on from talking with different software engineers is, it often makes sense to look if you run into a challenge that's going to require a lot of effort to build something from scratch. Right. First, check and see if something exists that can streamline that aspect of the process. Right. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, correct. Same for the frameworks. They are trying to solve the problem, and they're trying to make sure that we don't spend too much time on those things because they already exist. Yeah,
that's great.
So I would like to dive into the sentiments of the process. Shiva, looking back on the entire process, what aspect did you enjoy most?
Well, if I look back into especially my professional experience, right, with Fort Motor Companies, for instance, the process that I like the most is that I learned a lot. I learned a lot, not only with respect to how to code properly, but also how to make decisions in order to implement new tech stacks into your architect. That was one of the major things I liked, right?
Nice.
That's great. And so, having gone through the process of building an independent mobile app, building and launching an independent mobile app, how might you, given what you know now, how might you approach things differently in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, this reminds me of my first project that I launched into production. It wasn't meant to be launched in production. It was just, a learning project. But then I was trying to see, form a group of people and then ask them to test out my beta version. But then my beta version turned out to be a production version because a lot of people were using it. And I remember that time I did not even have a lower environment set up. So it was super hard for me to maintain that application or even to enhance it, because every code deployment I make will reflect right on the user's device. And that is something I would never do anymore again. As I mentioned since the beginning, it's really, really important to be part of your own DevOps area. Want to make sure that you have your pipeline set up, your environments are set up, and then only try to develop on top of that.
And Shiva, you said, just to take it back, you said that your favorite part about this process was the amount of information that you learned.
Yeah.
Is there anything that really just takes the cake about what you learned through the process? Did you learn something about yourself that was super cool? Yeah, let me know.
Well, okay, yeah, that's a good question. So, when you work on academic projects, when you work on personal projects, there's no one to review your code, right? You're the only one writing the code, and that's it. That goes right into production if you have a production environment. But then when you're writing code for, big companies, for instance, Ford Motor Company, you cannot write it and then assume it's correct. You will have a code review. And when you have a code review with a team, that's where all the learnings comes into play, right? Because everybody will come up with their opinion and, try to enhance it in an even better way. So they will be like, hey, you wrote that line number XY. Do you think that will, be able a large amount of data? And then we have a brainstorm session, and then we're like, oh yeah, that's a point I didn't even consider, right? So that's where we go back and try to enhance it, and then again create a pull request so they can review it. And that's only when it gets approved, it goes into production. So you can see how the quality of the code improves when you have like smart people on board.
That's awesome. And I'm just kind of curious, broadening that even further, any other words of wisdom for somebody who's setting out to heed your advice and launch a mobile application using Node.js? What advice might you give to somebody who's in that position?
Yeah, cool. I would say if you want to build something, try in your own. You don't stick with Node.js just because I like it, right? Just make sure that it is the best fit for whatever you're trying to design, whatever your use case is, and for whatever problem you're trying to solve. So I would always suggest documentation, always. I know beginning, I also made the mistake by not reading a lot. Generally, I don't really like reading, but when you're in software development, reading is something you have to do, right? Otherwise, you won't improve. And I think that's not only in software development. But then I would say there are like a lot of documentations out there. There's a huge community that writes article every day. So the chance of being stuck and not being able to move forward is almost 0%. There's always a solution out there. And last but not least, I would also, recommend always surround yourself with smart people, because that's the only way of, improving yourself as well as together with the team, right? And yeah, as I mentioned also earlier, that the best thing I liked about my professional project is that I could learn a lot. So what I've learned from that is that don't choose a company or a project just based on material compensation. Just always choose a company or a project where you can gain a lot of knowledge, because that's worth more, way more.
Absolutely. That's a whole career path is a whole conversation that I think we could have another time. But I think that's great advice, and I think that just getting out there and trying it is another kind of piece of advice that I've heard come up quite a bit, where like you can't be afraid to try and make mistakes. So the best engineers that I know, it's not that they study and then produce something that's absolutely perfect. It's they're just trying stuff, failing and learning quickly.
Yeah.
So I think that's another aspect of it as well. And I imagine when you're doing something independently, there's probably quite a bit less pressure than when you're at a company like Ford to try and fail. So that's an advantage of that route as well. So that's fantastic. So Shiva, now basically I just am curious to know, you mentioned the community that's built around this and where folks can turn for information. We're here representing Collider. That's what we're all about. So folks can join our Slack channel, which we'll link below, or join us for every third Thursday of the month, where we do our Mind Smash event, to come and meet like-minded technical technology minds, where you can come and collaborate and discuss these things. I know you're on GitHub, you're in our Slack, where can folks learn more about the project, connect with you? What's the best way to get in touch?
Sure. I mean, you can always send me an email at shivabhaggan@gmail.com, or you can always, link with me on LinkedIn. My name is Shiva Bhaggan as well on there. So feel free if you need anything. I'm more than happy to assist.
Perfect. That's excellent. And then I believe this particular mobile app is actually in Dutch, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right.
For those out there that speak Dutch, or if you just want to check it out, what's the name? What is the name of the application?
So the name of the application is Suri Webwinkel. It means the Suriname, online shop. It's launched in South America, and it's a company that based in Europe, in Amsterdam, right?
Got you. So we'll be sure to include a download link, but just mind you that you may need a translator if you don't speak Dutch. But
Right.
the application looks beautiful. I don't personally speak Dutch, but was very impressed clicking through it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's great. Ryan, what else is on your mind here?
Actually, I'm wondering about Shiva. Shiva, do you have any final thoughts to add? I know you just gave us a ton of wisdom to walk away with, but is there anything that maybe we didn't ask that you want to tell the people, or like let us know. What are your final thoughts?
Well, as the software engineer, when you work in projects, there are a lot of times when are at a point in time where you're just, burned out, you don't know how to proceed further. So maybe if that's something you guys are experiencing, try to give it like, a rest for a couple of minutes and then try it again. But never give up, never back down, right? That's really important.
Wow, that's great. So rest, don't keep pushing, right? If you're just so frustrated and so consumed, take a breath, get up, walk away. I love that.
Because I have seen that, right, in myself. When I try to solve a particular problem, usually I did spend like 8 hours straight away, but I think that's not the best way to do it. It's not the best practice, So you got to rest a little bit.
A mentor of mine would say, if you don't take breaks, your body will force you to.
Exactly right. That is totally correct.
Don't experience burnout. Take breaks.
Yeah.
Well, that is excellent. So definitely, if you enjoyed today's talk, or if you're looking to learn more, be sure to catch part 2 of this interview series coming soon. How to build and launch a React Native mobile app, which is how Shiva built the front end of his application. So we'll be diving into that more detail in our companion conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of Collider TV. Be sure to like and subscribe. Check out collider.altimetric.com, which will also be linked below. And we will see you next time.